It was a crisp autumn evening in Greenfield, a quaint suburban town on the outskirts of Chicago. The leaves were turning shades of amber and gold, and the air held that distinct chill that hinted at the coming winter. It was the sort of town where everyone knew each other's names, where the streets were lined with trees that seemed to stretch forever into the horizon, and where people lived their lives quietly without too many disturbances. But for Michael Sullivan, tonight would be anything but ordinary. Michael had come home early from work that day. He was an accountant at a firm downtown, and usually he stayed late to finish paperwork. But today, something felt different. He had been working long hours recently, and he'd decided it was time to surprise his wife, Sarah, with a quiet evening at home. He had planned a nice dinner, hoping it would give them a chance to reconnect. After all, their marriage had gone through its ups and downs, and with their daughter off to college, it felt like things were finally settling down. Sarah was a teacher at Greenfield High School, and Michael had always admired her dedication to her students. She was a good woman. At least that's what he had always believed. When Michael entered their house, it felt oddly still. There was no sound coming from the kitchen where Sarah would usually be preparing dinner. No laughter or conversation in the living room. The house, a beautiful two-story home they'd bought shortly after getting married, seemed empty, almost abandoned. He dropped his briefcase by the door, calling out her name, but there was no answer. A sense of unease crept up his spine, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt the need to go upstairs. Maybe she was in the bedroom, or perhaps she'd stepped out for a quick errand. But something in the air didn't sit right, like a shift in the atmosphere that he couldn't shake. Michael walked up the stairs, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He reached the landing and passed by their daughter's empty room, her childhood belongings still scattered around like forgotten memories. At the end of the hallway was their bedroom door, slightly ajar. He paused, listening. There was a strange noise, faint at first, almost like muffled breathing or whispers. Curiosity tugged at him, and without thinking he pushed the door open just a crack. And there it was. The sight that greeted him would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the room, Sarah was in the midst of an intimate moment, not with him, but with a young boy. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the teenager. The face was unmistakable. It was Danny Foster, one of Sarah's students. Michael had seen him around town a few times, but he never imagined he would find him in this kind of situation. The boy was 16, barely more than a child, and yet here he was, entangled with Sarah in a way no wife should be with another man, let alone a student. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the scene in front of him. Time seemed to stretch as he took in the image. The betrayal, the shock, the horror. His wife, the woman he had trusted with his heart, had been unfaithful, and with someone so young, someone who had been in their home, in their life. The sound of his breathing must have alerted them, because both Sarah and Danny froze. Danny, his face ashen with fear, quickly scrambled to pull away from Sarah. Sarah, her eyes wide with shock and shame, was too stunned to speak at first. "Michael," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can explain." But there was no explanation that could justify what Michael had just witnessed. The betrayal, the lie, the complete destruction of everything he had believed in. His blood ran cold as he stood there, struggling to hold on to his composure. "How long, Sarah?" His voice was low, trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah's face flushed red with humiliation, and she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted between Michael and the boy, who was now sitting on the bed, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. Michael's anger surged hot and raw, like an uncontrollable tide. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But something far darker started to take over. The pain of betrayal was overwhelming, and in that moment all he could think of was how badly he wanted to erase this image from his mind. He wanted to hurt them both. He wanted to make them pay for what they had done. Without thinking, Michael's hand reached for the nearest object, a vase on the nightstand, and he swung it at Danny. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the room as the vase struck Danny's head. The teenager fell backward onto the bed, his body going limp, and his head crashed against the headboard with a sickening thud. Sarah screamed, rushing to Danny's side. "Michael, what have you done?" she cried, panic seeping into her voice. She reached for the boy, trying to wake him, but Michael's mind was already clouded with rage. His heart raced as he looked down at the teenager's bloodied form. The room spun around him as he stared at the blood pooling on the bed, the shattered vase, the young boy who had dared to touch what was his. His mind told him that Danny was just a victim of the situation, that this wasn't his fault. But Michael didn't care. All that mattered was that his world had been shattered, and someone had to pay the price. "Get out," Michael snarled, his voice thick with venom. He barely registered the frantic tears in Sarah's eyes as she pleaded with him, begged him to stop. But it was too late. The darkness inside him had already taken over. In that moment, something in Michael snapped. The pain of betrayal mixed with the humiliation, and he was no longer the rational, calm man he had once been. The boy was a threat, an obstacle standing between him and the life he thought he had. In his mind, there was only one thing left to do, and that was to eliminate the threat. The silence in the bedroom was deafening. Sarah's sobs filled the air, but Michael barely registered them. His mind was consumed by the mess he had made, the mess he needed to clean up. The teenager, Danny, lay on the bed, blood seeping into the sheets. The sight of it, the sight of the betrayal, was like a haze that clouded his thoughts. The anger that had surged through him moments earlier was still there, but now it was replaced with something else. Fear. Fear that everything he had worked so hard to build was slipping away piece by piece. Michael stood there for a long moment, staring at Danny's motionless body. His hands trembled slightly, but he couldn't afford to panic. The consequences of what he had done were clear. This would not end well if anyone found out. He could already hear the sirens, see the flashing lights outside his house, feel the weight of the handcuffs on his wrists. There was only one thing to do now. Make sure this never saw the light of day. "Michael," Sarah whispered through her tears, her voice shaky and pleading. "What are we going to do?" He didn't answer her right away. His mind raced as he surveyed the room. The blood, the shattered vase, the broken sense of trust, everything had to disappear. There was no room for error. If anyone found out, if anyone even suspected what had happened, their lives would be over. His life would be over. "We need to get rid of him," Michael said flatly, his voice low but steady. The words sounded foreign to his own ears, but they were out there now. He couldn't take them back. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Michael, no, you can't." "He's dead, Sarah." Michael cut her off, his voice hardening. "He's not breathing. You saw what happened. You were in this with me, and you know there's no going back now. If we don't clean this up, we're both going down." Sarah's face paled as the full weight of his words sank in. She shook her head as if trying to deny the reality of the situation. "We can't do this. We can't just get rid of him. We'll be caught." Michael's jaw tightened. He grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "We will not be caught. Do you hear me? I'll handle everything. You just need to help me." She looked at him, her face filled with fear and disbelief. But in the end, she nodded. What else could she do? Michael was right. There was no turning back now. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. Michael quickly stripped the bed, tearing the blood-soaked sheets off and throwing them into a plastic bag. He gathered all the broken pieces of the vase and tossed them into another bag. The boy's body was a problem, one that had to be dealt with immediately. Michael moved quickly, his mind focused on one thing: getting rid of all the evidence. "Help me get him in the trunk," Michael said, his voice cold. Sarah, still in shock, hesitated for a moment, but then moved to Danny's side, carefully helping him lift the limp body from the bed. The weight of the teenager's body felt wrong in her hands, like a weight she couldn't possibly bear. Together, they managed to carry Danny's body down the stairs and into the garage, where Michael had already started the car. The night air was cool, but it offered no relief. Michael's pulse was racing as he opened the trunk of their sedan and gestured for Sarah to place the body inside. It was a grotesque act, sacrificing the life of a young boy to cover up their crime. But Michael had no other choice. If he didn't do this, if they didn't take this drastic step, their lives would be over. It didn't matter how good a person Sarah had been. It didn't matter how much Michael loved her. What mattered now was survival. and survival meant erasing all traces of Danny Foster from existence. Once the body was securely in the trunk, Michael slammed it shut and turned to Sarah. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. She was still crying, but Michael couldn't afford to show any sympathy. He needed her to be strong, to stay focused. "Get the cleaning supplies," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to make sure the blood's gone. There can't be any trace of this." Sarah nodded, stumbling toward the closet to grab the cleaning supplies. Her movements were mechanical now, her mind numbed by the shock of the situation. Michael didn't want to look at her. He didn't want to think about the fact that she had been part of this too. He didn't want to acknowledge the betrayal that she, too, had played a part in. All that mattered was that they covered their tracks. As Sarah worked to clean the bedroom, Michael stood by the door, keeping watch. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from outside, made his heart race with anxiety. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. "Michael," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling, "what are we going to do now?" Michael turned to look at her. She was on her knees, scrubbing at the carpet where Danny's blood had pooled. There was no trace of the vase now, no sign that the scene of violence had ever been there. It was as if the house had swallowed everything whole, but Michael knew it wasn't enough. They couldn't just clean up the room. They had to erase everything. They had to make sure no one would ever connect them to the murder. "We'll take him somewhere far from here," Michael said, his voice firm. "We'll dump his body where no one will find it. We'll burn the clothes, the sheets, everything." Sarah nodded, but her face was still filled with doubt. "And what about the police?" Michael took a deep breath. "We won't give them anything to go on. We'll act normal. No one can know." There was a long silence between them. Michael could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't say anything more. She knew better than to argue. They were in this together now, for better or worse. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic planning. Michael drove to an isolated spot outside of town, a place where no one ever went. The woods were dense there, the kind of place that could easily hide a body. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly locking with Sarah's. Her face was a mask of fear and uncertainty. But Michael didn't let that deter him. He couldn't afford to think about the consequences. He couldn't afford to think about the future. All that mattered was the present, and the present required him to do whatever it took to cover up the crime. They parked the car, and Michael opened the trunk. The body was still in there, lifeless, cold. Sarah helped him drag Danny's body into the woods, where they would bury it, and where no one would ever find it. They made sure to scatter leaves and branches over the area, hiding the boy's body as best as they could. Once the body was hidden, Michael stood back, wiping the sweat from his brow. He couldn't let himself feel anything. Not now. Not yet. "We're done," he said, his voice flat. "We'll go home, and we'll act like nothing happened. We can't let anyone know." Sarah didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her face pale and devoid of emotion. Michael didn't know what she was thinking, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He had done what needed to be done. The rest of the world would never know. But in the back of his mind, he knew it wasn't over. The investigation was coming, and no matter how much they tried to cover their tracks, someone would eventually uncover the truth. Michael just hoped they had enough time. Detective Olivia Pierce had seen plenty of disturbing cases in her career with the Greenfield Police Department, but nothing quite like this. It started as a simple missing person case. A teenager hadn't come home from school, his parents were frantic, and the police were called in. It was routine at first, the kind of case that would usually resolve itself within a few hours. Teenagers, after all, had a tendency to go missing for reasons that were more mundane than they appeared. Arguments with parents, running away for a few hours, or staying out past curfew. But when the body was found the next morning, everything changed. The victim was Danny Foster, a 16-year-old high school student. His body was discovered in a wooded area just outside of town, hidden beneath a blanket of leaves. The sight was grim, Danny's head was bloodied, and there was no sign of struggle, no sign of robbery, or anything that might suggest a motive for a random act of violence. Detective Pierce stood over the body, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She looked at the teenager's lifeless face, but her mind was already working, connecting dots that weren't immediately obvious. This wasn't some senseless act of violence. The positioning of the body, the lack of defensive wounds, everything suggested that Danny hadn't been fighting for his life. This was personal. This was calculated. As the coroner arrived to collect the body, Pierce walked back to her car, her boots crunching on the autumn leaves. The evidence so far wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to raise her suspicions. The first place she needed to go was to Danny's school. She needed to speak to people who knew him, teachers, classmates, anyone who could shed light on his life. Maybe, just maybe, someone would know something that would make all the pieces fit. The next morning, Detective Pierce sat across from Sarah Sullivan, the high school teacher who had been Danny's instructor. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes tired and red from a long night of worry. She had been notified about Danny's death early that morning, and it was clear that the news had shaken her to the core. She wasn't acting in the way someone would expect from a person caught in a scandal. Her reactions were genuine. Too genuine, maybe. "Mrs. Sullivan," Pierce began, her voice calm but probing, "I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few questions about Danny. We found his body this morning, and we're trying to piece together what happened." Sarah nodded, her fingers tightly gripping the arms of the chair. "Of course, Detective. I'm still in shock. I can't believe this is happening. You were Danny's teacher," Pierce continued, watching Sarah closely. "Did you notice anything unusual about him? Anything at all?" Sarah took a shaky breath before responding. "Danny was a good kid, smart, quiet. He wasn't one to get into trouble. But honestly, he kept to himself most of the time. I never saw any signs that he was in danger or involved in anything bad." "Did you have any personal interaction with him outside of class?" Pierce asked, her gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "Any after-school meetings, tutoring sessions, anything at all?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering nervously. "Number? We only ever spoke during class or in passing. I didn't know him very well outside of that." Pierce leaned forward slightly. There was something in Sarah's tone, something that didn't sit right. She had the feeling that Sarah wasn't telling her everything. Of course, it could be the shock, the trauma of losing a student, but there was still something nagging at Pierce. It could be nothing, but it could also be something. And in her line of work, she had learned to trust her instincts. "I understand this is hard," Pierce said, her voice softening, "but if you think of anything, anything at all, that could help us find out what happened to Danny, you need to let us know." "I will," Sarah replied quickly, her voice tight. She stood, the tension still thick in her posture, but her eyes no longer met Pierce's. I want to know who did this to him. He didn't deserve this." As Sarah left the room, Pierce stood, her mind racing. There was more to this story than she was being told. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way Sarah had reacted, too calm, too controlled, wasn't typical of someone who had just lost a student. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was guilt. Either way, it was something to consider. That afternoon, Pierce spoke to several of Danny's classmates, trying to piece together more of his life. Most of them described him as quiet, reserved, a bit of an outsider. But one classmate, a girl named Emily, mentioned something that caught Pierce's attention. "Danny wasn't just quiet," Emily said, looking down at her feet as she spoke. "He started hanging out with Mrs. Sullivan a lot last semester. It was kind of weird, you know? She'd ask him to stay after school for extra help, even though he didn't really need it. And I think they'd talk for a long time. Sometimes he'd leave really late." "Did you ever see them together?" Pierce asked, her voice sharp. Emily hesitated, biting her lip. "Once I saw them walking out of the school together after dark. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Pierce made a mental note. This was the lead she'd been looking for. It was small, but it was something. She needed to find out more about the nature of Sarah and Danny's relationship. She needed to know if it was more than just teacher-student, and if it was, she needed to know how deep it went. Later that day, Detective Pierce went to the Sullivan household. It was a quiet, well-kept home in a suburban neighborhood. Michael Sullivan answered the door, his face tired but composed. He seemed surprised but not overly concerned when she introduced herself. "Detective," Michael said, stepping aside to let her in. What's this about? I don't understand why you're asking about Sarah. She was Danny's teacher, nothing more. I'm just following up on some information, Pierce replied. We're trying to understand why Danny was with Sarah so often. It seems like he spent a lot of time with her after school. Michael's expression darkened, and Pierce could see the tension in his shoulders. I don't know what you're implying, he said sharply. Danny was just a student. There's nothing unusual about a teacher helping out a student. I understand, Mr. Sullivan, Pierce said, keeping her voice neutral, but it's important we clear up every detail. Did you ever notice anything strange between Sarah and Danny? Any changes in their relationship? Michael's eyes flickered for a moment, a brief flash of something, guilt, maybe, or discomfort, but it was gone almost immediately. Nothing like that. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Pierce studied him carefully, watching the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands shifted nervously at his sides. There was something he wasn't telling her, something he was hiding, and she knew she was getting closer to uncovering it. We're just doing our job, Mr. Sullivan, she said, her tone even. We'll be in touch. As she left the Sullivan house, Detective Pierce's mind raced. She now had a clearer picture of Danny's relationship with Sarah, but there were still more questions than answers. There was one thing she knew for sure. Something wasn't right in the Sullivan household. She needed to dig deeper into both Sarah and Michael's pasts. And she would, because Pierce had learned long ago that the truth always came out in the end. Detective Olivia Pierce had always prided herself on her ability to read people. It wasn't something she liked to admit, but it was a skill she had honed over the years. She knew how to spot a lie, how to sense when someone was hiding something, and Michael Sullivan's behavior was setting off every alarm in her head. As she drove back to the station that afternoon, her thoughts kept returning to the conversation she had just had with Michael. There was something in the way he reacted, his defensiveness, the way his eyes momentarily shifted when she pressed him about Sarah and Danny. He was hiding something. He knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't just the tone of his voice or his body language. It was the way he was trying so hard to appear calm, as though nothing was wrong. People who were guilty of something, especially something as serious as a murder, often tried to mask their fear with bravado, and Michael Sullivan had done just that. The more Olivia thought about it, the more she realized that Michael might not be as innocent as he claimed. She couldn't shake the image of him standing in the doorway that night, watching his wife and the young boy, his wife who had been unfaithful, and the boy whose body was now cold and lifeless in the woods. It seemed unlikely that he would simply accept the situation and walk away unscathed. His reaction to finding Sarah and Danny in bed together, the violence that had followed, Michael Sullivan had crossed a line that couldn't easily be erased. That evening, Olivia sat in her small office, scanning the files related to Danny Foster's case. The investigation was moving quickly now. The coroner had confirmed that Danny's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The blood loss from the head wound was significant, and the force of the blow indicated a violent attack, likely delivered by someone who was familiar with the victim. Someone who had been in close proximity, perhaps even someone Danny trusted. The lack of defensive wounds further indicated that Danny hadn't fought back. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nor was it a random act of violence. This was personal. And then there was the issue of Michael Sullivan's alibi. He claimed he had been at work late that night, but his phone records told a different story. Pierce had obtained a warrant to search Michael's phone, and what she found was enough to raise more suspicion. His phone had pinged off a cell tower near the woods where Danny's body had been found. That, combined with the fact that he had been the one to find Sarah and Danny together earlier that evening, made it impossible to ignore the possibility that Michael had been involved. But there was one more thing, the most important thing. Michael Sullivan's wife, Sarah. She was the key to this case. If Michael had killed Danny in a fit of rage over his wife's infidelity, then Sarah had to know more than she was letting on. She had to have seen something, or at least suspected something. And there was one thing Olivia knew for certain. Sarah wasn't being entirely truthful. If Sarah and Michael were involved in Danny's death together, then Sarah was equally culpable. She had to have known about Michael's actions, or at the very least, she had to have seen the aftermath. The next day, Pierce went to visit Sarah again, this time at her place of work, Greenfield High. School. The air was crisp as she stepped out of her car and made her way toward the entrance. It was early in the morning, and the students were just starting to trickle in. The school was bustling with energy, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. Pierce was hoping to speak to her in a public setting. She needed to catch Sarah off guard to see if she would slip up. It was clear Sarah wasn't telling her everything. She had to break through her calm exterior. Inside the school, Pierce was directed to Sarah's classroom, a quiet space filled with books and student projects. Sarah was seated at her desk, grading papers. She looked up as Pierce entered, a tight smile pulling at her lips. "Detective," Sarah said, standing up and extending her hand. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I know this is difficult, Mrs. Sullivan," Pierce said, her tone steady, "but I need to ask you a few more questions. I need to understand exactly what happened between you and Danny." Sarah's face paled, her eyes flicking nervously to the door, as if she were hoping someone would walk in and interrupt the conversation. She sat down slowly, folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "I've told you everything I know," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Danny was just a student. He never meant anything to me." Pierce leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Sullivan, we know you had a close relationship with Danny. A lot of the students say that you spent time with him outside of school, that you asked him to stay after hours. That's not normal, not for a teacher. Can you explain why you did that?" Sarah's hands trembled as she smoothed a piece of paper. "He was struggling with some personal issues. I just wanted to help him, that's all. He was a good kid, and I thought he needed someone to talk to." Pierce could see the lie in Sarah's eyes, but she needed more than just a hunch. "And you never thought this could be misinterpreted? Never thought that spending so much time alone with him, especially after school hours, might raise some questions?" Sarah's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Number, I didn't think it was a big deal. I was just trying to help him." There it was again. The defensiveness, the refusal to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a teacher trying to help a struggling student. This was something deeper, something more sinister. "I understand that you're under a lot of stress, Mrs. Sullivan," Pierce said, her voice softening. "But you need to understand that Danny's death is being treated as a murder investigation, and you were one of the last people to see him alive." Sarah looked away, her eyes blinking rapidly as if she were trying to hold back tears. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice breaking. "I would never." Pierce interrupted her gently. "I'm not accusing you of anything, but I need you to help me understand what happened that night. You have to be honest with me. Did Michael know about your relationship with Danny?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her face going pale once again. She looked down at her hands, taking a deep breath before answering. "Yes," Sarah said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He knew. He found out about Danny and me." Pierce's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. "What do you mean, he found out?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists on the desk. Michael was the one who found us together. That night, the night Danny was killed. He came home early, and he saw us." Olivia took a deep breath, piecing it together. It was beginning to make sense. Sarah had tried to shield herself, but the truth was finally coming to light. Michael had caught them, and the situation escalated from there. The motive was clear now: jealousy, rage, betrayal. Michael had killed Danny, but Sarah had been a part of it, knowingly or unknowingly. But there was still more to uncover. Sarah had been lying about her level of involvement, and Pierce wasn't done yet. She needed to know everything: what Sarah knew, how far she was willing to go to protect her husband, and whether they would both pay for their crimes. "We need to talk to Michael," Pierce said, standing up, "and we need to do it now." Detective Olivia Pierce stood in the parking lot of the Greenfield Police Department, staring at her car. Her mind was swirling with the pieces she had gathered from Sarah Sullivan's reluctant confession. The interview had been revealing, but it had also left Pierce with more questions than answers. Sarah had admitted that Michael knew about her affair with Danny, but there was still a lot left unspoken. Michael Sullivan had found them together the night Danny had died. That was the crucial detail. It explained the motive. It explained the violence. But there was something nagging at Olivia. Sarah had said she had no part in Danny's death. She had claimed to be a passive bystander, too afraid to intervene. But Olivia didn't believe that. No, Sarah Sullivan wasn't as innocent as she was trying to make herself out to be. She had been complicit, whether by silence or active involvement. The fact that she was so quick to cover up for her husband pointed to something much darker beneath the surface. And now it was time to confront Michael Sullivan. The Sullivan house loomed in the distance as Pierce pulled up to the quiet suburban street. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The neighborhood was still, almost too still, with only the occasional dog barking or car passing by. As she parked her car and stepped out, Pierce noticed the curtains twitching in the window of the Sullivan house, as if someone was watching her approach. Michael was already aware that she was coming. When she knocked on the door, it was Michael who answered. He seemed calm, almost eerily so, as if the events of the past few days hadn't rattled him at all. His eyes didn't betray a flicker of concern when he saw the detective standing on his doorstep. "Detective Pierce," he greeted her, his voice smooth like he was expecting her. "What brings you here today?" "I need to talk to you again, Mr. Sullivan," Pierce said, her tone firm. "This is a serious matter. We need to go over the events from the night Danny Foster died." Michael didn't say anything at first. He only nodded, stepping aside to allow Pierce inside. "Please come in," he said, motioning toward the living room. It was quiet in there, too. There was no sign of Sarah. She must have been somewhere else in the house, perhaps hiding, perhaps avoiding another confrontation. Pierce sat down on the couch, crossing her arms. Michael followed suit, settling into the armchair across from her. His body language was calm, but there was an edge to his expression that Pierce couldn't ignore. The tension was thick between them. "Mr. Sullivan, I've spoken to your wife," Pierce began. "She's told me about your confrontation with Danny the night he died. She says you found them together, and that's when everything escalated." Michael's face went rigid for a moment, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's correct," he said, his voice calm but guarded. "I came home early that night and I saw them, Danny and Sarah. I couldn't believe it." "And how did you react?" Pierce asked, watching him closely. She could see the weight of those words in his eyes, the simmering anger that he was trying so hard to conceal. I confronted them," Michael said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "I yelled at them. I told Sarah how much she'd hurt me, and I told Danny to leave. He didn't deserve her. He was just a kid. He wasn't good enough for her." Pierce leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his face. "And then what happened, Mr. Sullivan?" Michael shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking away for a moment before he met her gaze again. "I don't remember all the details. It's a blur. I was angry, so angry." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And then everything went black. I don't know what happened after that." Pierce took a deep breath, carefully choosing her words. "You don't remember?" Michael shook his head, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. I don't remember. It all happened so fast. One moment I was yelling at Danny, and then the next, he was dead. I never intended for it to happen, Detective. You have to believe me. I didn't want to hurt him, but I was furious. Sarah had betrayed me. Olivia's mind was racing. Michael's confession about the anger he felt, his willingness to lash out, it all made sense. But the piece that didn't fit was his total lack of memory about what happened after the confrontation. His selective amnesia wasn't something she was buying. "Michael," she said, her voice steady, "you've told me that you were angry, but anger doesn't cause a blunt force trauma wound like the one Danny sustained." The coroner confirmed that the blow to Danny's head was brutal and violent. This wasn't a spontaneous act, it was deliberate. For a moment, Michael's expression faltered. His eyes darted briefly to the floor, as though the weight of the truth was starting to sink in. He was trying to hold himself together, but the cracks were beginning to show. I don't know what happened, Detective. I swear. I just don't remember." Pierce could see the desperation in his eyes, the flicker of guilt that he was trying to suppress. She could tell that he was lying, but his lies were becoming more sophisticated. He had learned how to hide his guilt, how to manipulate the truth to fit his narrative. This was a man who was trying to protect himself, and possibly his wife, at any cost. She needed more than this. She needed him to crack. "I'm not buying it, Michael," Pierce said, her voice hardening. "I know you don't want to admit what happened that night, but you have to face the truth. You didn't just lose control. You planned this. You knew what you were doing when you struck Danny. When you—" "Stop!" Michael suddenly shouted, his voice rising. He stood up abruptly, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know anything. You don't understand. I didn't want to kill him. I didn't want to do it." For a moment, Pierce thought Michael might lash out physically, but he stopped short, his hands trembling. He slumped back into the chair, his face pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The facade was breaking. "I didn't mean to kill him," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I just couldn't stand it. Seeing them together. She was mine, and he didn't deserve her. I lost control, and when I saw him lying there, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to go away." Pierce knew she had him. The guilt was written all over his face now. Michael Sullivan had killed Danny Foster in a fit of jealousy and rage. He had tried to cover it up, but the truth was slowly leaking out. The pieces were all falling into place. "Michael, you've just confessed to murder," Pierce said softly, "and I'm going to make sure you're held accountable for what you've done." He was silent for a long moment, staring at the floor as if he were trying to process the weight of what he had just admitted. And then finally he looked up, his eyes filled with resignation. "I know," he said, his voice hollow. "I know." Detective Pierce stood up, her mind already processing the next steps. Michael Sullivan had confessed, but there was still Sarah to deal with. She had been complicit, whether she had been an active participant or not. Michael hadn't acted alone, and Sarah, she knew more than she had let on. Olivia wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The air felt colder the next morning, as if the world itself had tightened its grip on the Sullivan family's secret. Detective Olivia Pierce sat at her desk, reviewing the transcript of her interview with Michael Sullivan. His confession had confirmed what she had suspected all along. He was guilty of murdering Danny Foster. The motive had been jealousy and rage over his wife's affair, but there was still more to uncover. Sarah had been complicit in some way. Whether she had been an active participant or had just turned a blind eye, she was tied to this crime. Olivia knew she couldn't let her off the hook that easily. Michael's confession had cracked the case wide open, but it hadn't been the final piece of the puzzle. Sarah had lied, manipulated, and concealed the truth for too long. She had covered for her husband, protecting him even after he had killed Danny. Olivia needed to get Sarah to come clean about everything, to understand how deep her involvement really went. Olivia drove to the Sullivan house once again, but this time, the approach felt different. The house stood there quiet and imposing, as if it, too, knew that the truth was on the verge of being fully exposed. It was a moment of reckoning. Sarah Sullivan was the last piece of the equation, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. As Olivia knocked on the door, she steeled herself for whatever Sarah might say. She could already feel the tension in her stomach, the anticipation of knowing that this conversation would reveal whether Sarah had any intention of taking responsibility for her part in the murder. Sarah answered the door quickly, almost as if she were expecting the visit. Her eyes were tired and her face was pale, but there was no trace of guilt or fear in her expression. It was as though she had resigned herself to whatever had happened, whatever was about to happen. "Detective Pierce," she said quietly, stepping aside to let Olivia in. "I suppose we need to talk." Olivia nodded and stepped into the house, the familiar smell of home-cooked meals still lingering in the air. But there was nothing comforting about it now. Sarah led her to the living room, where Michael had been just a day ago. The tension between them was palpable, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to spill out. "Sarah," Olivia said as they sat down across from each other, "I need to ask you again. What happened the night Danny was killed? What exactly did you know?" Sarah's face hardened, her eyes flickering with something that Olivia couldn't quite place: fear, guilt, defiance. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as if weighing her words carefully. I've already told you everything I know, Detective, Sarah said, her voice steady but strained. Michael found us together, yes. But I didn't have anything to do with Danny's death. I swear to you. Olivia studied her closely. There was still that tightness in Sarah's jaw, that refusal to make eye contact for more than a few seconds. Sarah was lying, and Olivia knew it. Sarah, Olivia said slowly, leaning forward, Michael has confessed. He told me everything about that night. He told me that he killed Danny because of what he saw. He also told me that you were there and that you didn't stop him. At the mention of Michael's confession, Sarah stiffened. Her eyes flitted nervously to the door, then to the windows. She was trying to keep her composure, but Olivia could see the cracks. Michael had already confessed to the murder, but now Sarah's role in the events had to be addressed. She wasn't getting away with being an innocent bystander. Michael killed Danny, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. But I didn't make him do it. I didn't want him to kill Danny. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted everything to stop. Olivia's gaze never wavered. But you didn't stop it, did you? You didn't stop him from taking Danny's life. Sarah's lips trembled, her eyes tearing up now. She looked down at her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. The guilt was starting to creep in, the reality of what had happened and what she had been complicit in, hitting her all at once. No, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't stop him. I didn't even try. I should have. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. The silence between them stretched on for a few moments as Sarah finally allowed herself to break down. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths, and Olivia could see the weight of the admission sinking in. But even as she cried, Olivia knew that the guilt Sarah felt now was nothing compared to the consequences she would face. It was time for Sarah to come clean, to finally take responsibility for her actions. Sarah, Olivia said, her voice firm yet empathetic, you need to understand that by not stopping Michael, by covering for him, you've become just as guilty as he is. You were an accomplice in Danny's death. You may not have struck the blow, but you allowed it to happen. Sarah's tears continued to fall, but her gaze remained steady, locked on Olivia's. She didn't deny the truth this time. She knew it was too late for that. I was so angry, Sarah choked out, her voice breaking. I was angry at Michael for ignoring me, for neglecting me. I was angry at myself for letting things get so far. And Danny, he gave me the attention I needed. He made me feel special. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to stop it. Olivia's heart ached for Sarah in that moment. The woman before her was clearly broken, torn apart by her own choices. But this wasn't just about Sarah's guilt. It was about Danny's death and the consequences of those actions. You can't change what happened, Sarah, Olivia said quietly, but you can choose to do the right thing now. You have to take responsibility for your role in this. You have to help us understand the full truth of that night. Sarah swallowed hard, wiping the tears from her cheeks. She nodded, the defeat in her expression telling Olivia that she had finally accepted the reality of her situation. I'll tell you everything, Sarah whispered. I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you about Michael and me. That afternoon, Sarah Sullivan gave a full confession, detailing the events of the night Danny had died. She admitted that, while Michael had been the one to kill Danny, she had been complicit in his actions. She had done nothing to stop the violence, and in fact had been so consumed by her own emotions and her affair that she had turned a blind eye to what Michael was doing. When Michael had struck Danny, Sarah hadn't intervened. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't done anything to prevent the murder. It was a tragic and chilling admission. The investigation moved quickly after Sarah's confession. Michael and Sarah Sullivan were arrested and charged with the murder of Danny Foster. Their trial would come later, but for now, the town of Greenfield had been shaken to its core. The once seemingly perfect suburban family had crumbled under the weight of their own secrets and lies. But Detective Olivia Pierce wasn't done yet. The case had been solved, but the wounds would take much longer to heal. The truth had been uncovered, but for those who had known Danny, it would never be enough. The town had lost more than a young life that night. It had lost its innocence, and Olivia couldn't help but wonder, how many more secrets were lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to come to light? The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read aloud. Michael and Sarah Sullivan stood side by side, their faces devoid of emotion as the judge pronounced the sentences for their roles in the brutal murder of Danny Foster. The jury had deliberated for only a few hours, and their decision was swift. Both Michael and Sarah were guilty of murder, Sarah as an accomplice, and Michael as the one who had delivered the fatal blow. Michael had never fully admitted to the depth of his rage, but his confession was damning enough. Sarah, though not the one to physically kill Danny, had been complicit. The jury had agreed that her failure to stop her husband, her decision to remain silent, and her attempt to cover up the crime were just as culpable. They had both been consumed by jealousy, pride, and selfishness, and it had cost a young life. The trial had been emotionally taxing for everyone involved. The prosecution had painted a vivid picture of a troubled marriage. A wife seeking attention from a younger man, a husband unable to control his jealousy. The defense, on the other hand, had tried to argue that Michael had acted in the heat of passion and that Sarah had been overwhelmed by guilt and fear. But in the end, the truth was clear. Danny had paid the ultimate price for their selfishness. In the weeks that followed the trial, life in Greenfield seemed to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a tragedy. The residents of the small town tried to move on, but the memory of Danny's death lingered like a shadow. People whispered in hushed voices about the Sullivans' downfall, about how a seemingly perfect family had been torn apart by secrets and lies. For Detective Olivia Pierce, the aftermath was less about the resolution of the case and more about the psychological toll it had taken on her. She had seen crime scenes before. She had solved cases involving violence, betrayal, and heartbreak. But this one had been different. There was something about Danny Foster's death, about the way it had unfolded so slowly, so tragically, that had stuck with her. She had seen the devastation on Sarah's face during the interviews, the guilt and the fear. She had watched as Sarah, a woman who had once seemed so composed, finally broke down under the weight of her own actions. But it wasn't just Sarah that haunted Olivia. It was the image of Michael Sullivan, the man who had killed a child in a fit of jealousy, a man who had once been so calm, so collected, but who had ultimately revealed his true nature in that single moment of violence. Olivia sat at her desk one afternoon, staring at the case file. The trial was over, but it didn't feel finished. The last few months had been an emotional roller coaster. Long hours spent chasing leads, uncovering secrets, and slowly piecing together the truth. But now, with the case closed and the Sullivans behind bars, she was left to pick up the pieces of her own thoughts. It wasn't the guilt of having solved the case that weighed on her. It was the disquiet in her chest, the feeling that something was still unresolved. She had seen Sarah and Michael's faces in the courtroom. She had witnessed their guilt, their shame, their emptiness. But despite everything, despite the confessions and the hard evidence, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that they had both been hiding something. There had been so much tension between Sarah and Michael during the investigation, so many contradictory statements and half-truths. And there was something about their behavior that had never quite added up. Olivia thought back to the day she had interviewed Michael in his living room, after Sarah had admitted to everything. The man had confessed, but his confession had been so vague, too clean, too perfect. He had claimed not to remember what had happened after the confrontation with Danny, but Olivia knew better than to take that at face value. What if there was more to the story? What if Michael hadn't told the whole truth about that night? The thought gnawed at Olivia, and for the first time since the case had closed, she felt the familiar weight of doubt settle on her shoulders. Later that evening, Olivia found herself driving to the Greenfield Cemetery, a place she hadn't visited since the day Danny's body had been discovered. She hadn't intended to go there, but something had compelled her to make the drive. It was as if the unanswered questions were calling her, urging her to seek closure in the only way she knew how, by finding the truth. The cemetery was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves as the wind blew through the trees. Olivia walked slowly down the rows of gravestones, her footsteps soft on the gravel path. She paused at Danny's grave, the simple marker still fresh with flowers left by mourners. Her eyes lingered on the inscription, "Beloved son, taken too soon." Olivia had seen too many cases like this, too many senseless deaths, too many families torn apart. But Danny's death had struck her differently. It wasn't just the fact that he was so young. It was the way his life had been extinguished by the betrayal of the two people who should have protected him most. His parents, Michael and Sarah, had failed him in the worst way imaginable. She stared at the gravestone, her thoughts swirling. What if Michael hadn't been the only one to take part in Danny's death? What if Sarah had known more than she had admitted? In the days leading up to the trial, Olivia had noticed something peculiar about Sarah's demeanor. While Michael had been the one to confess to the murder, Sarah had always seemed to know just how to handle the situation. She hadn't broken down under pressure. She hadn't shown the same level of remorse as Michael had. Could it be that Sarah had been the one to plan Danny's death, to orchestrate the entire affair? The thought lingered in Olivia's mind as she stood in front of Danny's grave. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing that made sense now. Michael had confessed, but what if his confession was a cover for something more sinister? Something that had been carefully concealed by both him and Sarah? The next day, Olivia went back to the station and requested a final round of interviews with both Sarah and Michael. She needed to be sure. She needed to know if there was something they were still hiding. This time, she wasn't going to accept half-truths or vague statements. She was going to get to the heart of it all. She would get the answers, no matter how long it took. As she prepared for the interviews, Olivia knew that she was about to dive deeper into a web of lies than she had ever been before. The case was far from over. And with that realization, the weight of her responsibility came crashing down once again. Danny Foster had been taken from this world too soon, and if there was anything left to uncover, Olivia Pierce would make sure that his death would not be in vain.